Hello, everyone. I'm Dolly Duffy, the Executive Director of your Alumni Association. There's so many things I want to say about tonight, but the biggest one is thank you. Thanks for coming out in a kind of a chilly, damp night. I like to think that it feels like we were just talking about Ireland, that we've just come and we're all in Ireland listening to a lecture. And with a name like Meghan, I think that that's probably true. Tonight is all about when to take a leap of faith. But I want to put this in some context because 8 weeks ago, we responded to the responses that we got back on a survey that says we want more continuing education. Notre Dame has so much at their fingertips, and we want to have some of that. So we launched ThinkND. In 8 short weeks, we've had 24,000 visitors to the site, which is pretty amazing. And we've had 8,400 people actually put their name in and sign up and say, yes, I want the newsletter. So we know that this is something great. But when we thought about what was next, this is part of Big Questions. And how many of you have had a chance to see the first round of Big Questions, right? Which is probably why you're here. And what makes a life good? Well, that was Professor Meghan Sullivan, and I'm here to introduce both of them, but I want to start with Meghan and tell you that Meghan's done some incredible work with a program called God in the Good Life. And I love the title of it, and because of that, they've, since 2016, over 1,500 students have gone through this program. It's been so popular that Meghan has been able to raise $1.3 million to expand the program to over 100 schools that are looking for really positive, productive ways to teach philosophy. But also what you should know about Meghan is she works out like nobody's business. So Meghan and I are at the same gym. And not only is she pumping iron the whole time, but the whole time she's dispensing little tidbits of philosophy to the trainer. And I just listen and I love it. So we're thrilled. And then Meghan is joined by Paul Blaschko. And Paul is the Assistant Director for Research and Outreach in the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Studies, which Meghan directs. And he's on the core team for God and the Good Life. And his area of expertise is on ways we are responsible for our beliefs, hence tonight. Paul will soon teach the next course, and this is just a little bridge in between. You get a little sneak preview. He's going to teach what to believe in uncertain times that will release in early 2020. So I could say so much more. Instead, I'm going to bring the experts up. Please help me welcome Meghan and Paul.
Thank you so much, Dolly, and thank you guys especially for coming out tonight. Both those of you guys that braved the wonderful South Bend weather to be here in person and all the people who are taking time out of their schedule to tune in at home. It certainly means a lot to me as a philosopher and as somebody who really cares about Notre Dame that so many people in our community would be willing to take a break on a busy Thursday night to come together and be part of a big conversation about a major philosophical question. I think that speaks volumes about our community. Philosophy, when it got started in ancient Greece 2,400 years ago, in Zhou Dynasty China 2,400 years ago, it's been concerned with this question about how to be genuinely happy. If you put yourself in the shoes of the Greeks in Athens in 2,400 years ago, 400 BC, they had what they thought was the world's most powerful navy. They had invented geometry. They were an extremely wealthy and prosperous society. And philosophy got started there because even though all of these things were going well materially for Athens, they still felt that there was something significantly missing in their life. Socrates, the kind of grandfather of philosophy, was famous for going around to absolutely every person that he met, young or old, and saying, you have so much that's going well in your life. You have reputation and honor and money. But are you genuinely happy? Are you genuinely caring for things like the truth? Caring about your moral commitments, caring about your destiny. Socrates famously was so annoying in asking these questions that the Athenians killed him. Paul and I are hoping that's not going to happen to us tonight. But we do want to raise these questions for you guys because as philosophers, we think that philosophy plays a really important role in having a full education and also having a full conception of this life that you try to enjoy. Paul and I, 5 years ago, with some of our other colleagues, got started on this really ambitious project at Notre Dame. we wanted to take the core of Greek philosophy, this core question, what do you need to think about and wonder about and talk about and reason through in order to lead a good life, and take that question and make it feel very much alive to 18 and 19-year-old first-year students that arrive on this campus. That was the beginning of this God in the Good Life project that Dolly mentioned. Every student who comes through our course, and we teach about 700, 750 each year, the very first day of their first day of college, we raise this question to them. We have 4 questions to them. How are you, from this point onward, going to decide what to believe? What classes are you going to take? What standards are you going to hold your beliefs to? Which kinds of questions are you going to be skeptical of? And which kinds of questions are you going to be really trusting about? What do you think you owe to other people in your life? And how are you going to navigate all of the moral disagreement that we might face in the course of a life? Does religious faith play any important conception in your view of a good life? And if so, what does faith mean to you? What role does religious commitment, what does faith in God play in shaping your vision of the good life? That's the question we're going to wrestle with you guys tonight. And then finally, our lives in the standpoint of the universe, they're pretty short. So what does it take? What kinds of investments do we need to make? Which kinds of values do we need to cultivate to ensure that these lives are meaningful? And what does it mean to have a meaningful life? That's actually the question that we're wrestling with all of our freshmen these next couple weeks in class. How do we do this? Well, for our students, we make them debate the heck out of these questions. We oftentimes will introduce them to philosophers who've had good ideas. We think about how to answer them. But it's not enough to just know what dead people in Greece 400 BC thought about happiness. We want to know what you think about happiness. What kinds of arguments and evidence and headings are you going to chart for your own life to try to pursue these questions? So we try really hard to give our students real-life case studies that cause them to have to reason like a philosopher about these big questions. We're also going to do that a bit for you tonight. Another thing that Paul and I noticed as we got really going on this project is that these questions, what do I need to do to be happy? What are my moral commitments? They're live questions for 18 and 19-year-old Notre Dame students, but they're also really pressing questions for the rest of us too. I mean, we got going on the class and we realized in many of our teaching meetings we were wrestling with how we would answer these own questions about caring for our own souls. We realized talking with alums and talking with our colleagues that these are important questions that the university can research, important questions for alumni outreach and for larger conversations in the Notre Dame community. And that's what really gave rise to a bunch of programs that are now surrounding this Good Life initiative on campus. So we teach God in the Good Life. We've also been really happy to partner with the Alumni Association to make shorter, bite-sized version of this course available for really busy professionals like yourselves. As Dolly mentioned, we run a pretty extensive program with 108 other college campuses to help them design courses that are going to make these questions come alive to students on their campuses. And we also research these questions. It's some of these topics, like what it means to have trust in an institution, how can we build institutions that are more ethical, these are the kinds of topics that people with PhDs who conduct research full-time can actually help us make progress on. And at the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study, we take on a lot of those questions. Tonight, we are going to give you guys a preview of one of the questions that we talk with a lot of freshmen at Notre Dame about, and Paul and I actually write about quite a bit. That's the question, what role does faith play in your vision of the good life? And in particular, what is it to have a good form of faith in your life? In our class, we always pose a bunch of different potential answers to all of the questions that we raise for the students. Some of these answers are incompatible. We want students to see how these philosophers debate with each other and how their debates have stakes for real questions. When we do the religion unit, we tend to focus on a couple different answers to this question, what is religious faith? We look at Anselm and Aquinas, who think you can reason deductively to the fact that God exists. Every rational person should believe that an omnipotent creator exists in this world. We talk about the problem of evil, and we read David Hume, and we read Dostoevsky, who really wonder about whether or not any omnipotent, morally perfect being could exist given the amount of suffering that we see in the world. We read Kierkegaard, who tries to argue that faith is inherently absurd. Living a life of faith means transcending reason, or sometimes putting philosophy behind you. We read Nietzsche. Nietzsche is the favorite of one of our students who's here tonight. Nietzsche tries to really annoy you about faith and try to ask you these questions about whether religion is even doing the things it says it can do in your life. those are all interesting topics. We'd be very happy to talk about those more in Q&A. But the philosopher we want to focus in on tonight has a very different view of faith. And this is William James. He's an American philosopher. He's usually the first of the American philosophers we teach in the God and the Good Life syllabus. And James thinks faith plays a vital part in many aspects of our lives, not just our religious lives, though crucially religious faith is important to James. He also thinks that faith requires us to take a different view about how important evidence is to our beliefs. So we're going to introduce you guys to this debate tonight. We're going to say some things that are hopefully provocative, and the biggest outcome we're hoping for is that in the lobby later on and at Thanksgiving next week, you come away with some really annoying philosophical questions that you can raise to your family members. Because a big part, Socrates is our patron saint, a big part of philosophy is having the annoying question kind of put on your heart so that you start thinking about it, and that's where the really important work comes in developing your faith life. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul, who will get you warmed up for James with a little story.
All right. Thank you, Megan. So this is Amanda Eller. She's a yoga instructor from Hawaii. You may remember on May 8th of this year, 2019, she parked her car in the Makawa Federal National Forest Reserve and decided to take a walk. She didn't even take her cell phone or a water bottle. She didn't think she was going to be gone that long. But about halfway into the walk, she got this sense that her car wasn't following the path, but instead was somewhere off the path to the right. So she started wandering. This is where things get kind of nightmarish. 17 days later, she was still walking. She had broken her knee after falling off a small bluff. Her shoes got washed away in a flash flood. She survived, she said, by eating unidentifiable berries and whatever moths were unlucky enough to land on her in the night. And the way that she was rescued, she was ultimately rescued, was phenomenally improbable. So this group of rescuers who were in a helicopter decided on a whim that they were going to go 7 miles outside of the search area just to see if they could find anything. And sure enough, they looked down, and in a clearing next to a pond, they saw an emaciated Amanda Eller. Now, after she was rescued from her hospital bed, she gave an interview to the New York Times. And in that interview, she said the following thing. She said, "I was really starting to doubt whether I could survive, and I wanted to give up. But the only option I had was life or death." Now, there's a lot of really interesting things about this story. What grips me as a philosopher, and this is a theme in any sort of extreme survival stories that you'll hear, is that if Amanda Eller had taken a step back and just considered objectively what the odds were that she was going to survive, she would have concluded that they were astronomically low. If she thought to herself, what does the evidence support here? What should I believe? Am I going to survive or am I going to die? She would have concluded that the evidence supported that she probably wasn't going to make it. And yet, she committed to belief that she was going to make it. This case brings up 2 really interesting and important questions about faith. So if we think about faith as a life-structuring commitment to a claim that we hope is true, Amanda Eller's story lets us ask, first, when faith is rational, and whether faith has to be rational, or whether there are some circumstances, like these life and death survival stories, that are so extreme that it's okay to just be irrational, but do the thing that might lead to your survival. Secondly, and this is going to be really important to William James, she lets us ask this question, whether it's ever okay or even good to believe beyond the evidence. So typically we think, and we teach our students this, it's really important that your beliefs match up with the evidence, but William James wants us to ask whether there are certain scenarios in which you can let your beliefs go out ahead of the evidence. So to let us get into this question, to give us some framework and some potential answers, I'm going to let Meghan tell us more about William James and about the theory that he has regarding faith.
Yeah, so James is a really interesting figure. Is anybody here a psychology major or a professional psychologist? Usually when I ask this to students, a bunch of hands go up, and I'm like, oh, we got so much work to do. If you're a psychology major or a psychologist, you have William James to thank for your entire discipline, because he really, in the late 1800s, set down the rules that became contemporary psychology, at least in this country. He was born in New York to a somewhat prosperous and a little bit eccentric family, the James family. His brother's Henry James, is a very famous novelist. James was Swedenborgian. His parents were Swedenborgian. Is anybody here Swedenborgian? I usually never get that at Notre Dame audiences. His parents were part of a version of the Christian church that was a little bit heterodox. They were very interested in different forms of religious experience. They talked about religion and comparative religion constantly at the dinner table growing up. So James grew up in a family where he was encouraged to think philosophically about the nature of religion and religious faith. James also suffered debilitating depression through most of his teenage and adult life. And if you read his writings, obviously this is one of the routes by which he finds himself getting very interested in the discipline of psychology. It's also really important for James that thinking about religious experience and meditating on religious experiences that he thought he would have over the course of his life, that he credits that with helping him through some of the darkest points of his depressive episodes. So James has a complicated but also deeply personal and authentic relationship with religion. In the late 1890s, this guy is at the height of his career. He is one of the most important professors in Harvard's history. He's founded a new discipline of study, and he gets a letter from the undergraduate philosophy club at Brown University. They say, like, "Dear Professor James, would you please come address our august club?" You can imagine it's probably like 8 snot-nosed 20-year-old kids at Brown sending this letter out of the blue, a Hail Mary pass to this famous professor asking if he'd come talk to their club. And James remarkably says yes. And not only does he agree to give a presentation at this undergraduate philosophy club, but he decides he's going to write a brand new paper for these students. He wants to address a question that he thinks is really important for undergraduates in his own day. Here's the question. In this age of education and rapid speed knowledge and scientific investigation, is there any room for the life of faith anymore, or are all of these university students just becoming atheists as a result of the increase in their education? James thinks really smart people should still take a risk and adopt religious beliefs, still explore religious faith, even if they think that they don't have evidence that matches their really high intellectual standards for that faith. He thinks faith can still be really important. So he wants to give arguments to these undergraduates at Brown that the life of faith is a really important component of the good life, and that even if they don't think they have enough evidence for claims like Jesus rose from the dead or that we have experiences of a loving God, even if the evidence isn't quite there for them yet, they should still take the risk and form religious beliefs. So that's his audience. And he goes on to write it into a paper, The Will to Believe. It becomes one of the most important papers in the history of philosophy of religion. It sets up new questions that to this day become really important questions about the nature of faith and evidence. So that's pretty amazing. We're going to introduce you to James. First, this is the only bit of philosophy jargon for today, so you can sound really fancy at Thanksgiving. If people aren't agreeing with you, just throw some philosophy terms at them. Here's the one distinction you need to get to really understand James's argument with some of his philosophical opponents. James is an example of a really sophisticated doxastic voluntarist. Doxastic is just a fancy way of talking about belief. Voluntarist is just a pretentious way of talking about choice. Doxastic voluntarists think that some of our beliefs are a matter of free choice. We freely choose to have those beliefs. Doxastic involuntarists are philosophers who disagree, who think that our beliefs are never something that we freely choose. Our beliefs are always forced on us by the evidence that we're given. So to get a handle on this, I think the best way to think about it is to contrast how we think of beliefs with how we think of actions. So suppose before this talk tonight, I'm walking in the door with Paul, and he says, "Hey, Meghan, I will pay you $10,000 if you get in front of the alumni club and you shout, 'Go Blue,' during the middle of your presentation. I'll pay you $10,000. I can reason about whether or not I'm going to take his bet. I can decide, like, is the money worth it to me? How afraid am I of Dolly? Dolly also pumps some serious iron at the gym. And I can decide on the basis of how good or bad it would be for me whether or not I'm going to take Paul's bet. Now let's suppose coming in, or we're already in the presentation, just now Paul whispers to me, "Hey, Meghan." "Yeah, Paul? I'll pay you $10,000 if you can believe that this auditorium is totally empty. I'll pay you $10,000 if you believe that." One of our colleagues was teaching William James to a huge group of 150 freshmen, and he was going through this example, and he's like, "What would one of you do if I said I'd pay you $10,000 to believe the auditorium is empty?" And one of the students in the back shouted, "Who said that?" What a jerk. Smart ass. Look, you can behave as though you have formed a belief, but you might think you can't just control your beliefs on a whim the same way you can control your actions. There's something that kid would have to do to make it so that he was no longer aware of all the other people in the auditorium. Maybe he could take a hallucinogenic drug or put on noise-canceling headphones and put a blindfold on. But you can't just at will change your beliefs the same way you can at will change your actions. That's the heart of the doxastic involuntarist position. They say all of our beliefs are like that. They're just evidence comes at us in the world and we form our beliefs as a result. Doxastic voluntarists, and James falls into this camp, think maybe that's true for beliefs about what we're seeing or smelling or feeling, but religious beliefs, political beliefs, beliefs about the good life, those are beliefs that in a certain sense we exercise our agency over. We make choices to believe those things, and we can be held responsible for those choices. So James thinks in certain cases, especially for really complicated intellectual claims, there's some part of us that goes in that chooses those beliefs and chooses to cultivate them and adopt them. And that's one of the things that's going on with religious faith. So hold that in the back of your mind. James has like 3 philosophers that he's really disagreeing with in the course of developing his theory. And understanding the disagreements is partially how we understand how cool William James and this idea is. So the first disagreement James has is with Blaise Pascal. How many of you guys are familiar with Pascal's wager? Pascal's wager, super controversial argument in the history of philosophy. Pascal, really famous Enlightenment philosopher, actually extremely committed Christian who thought he had tons of evidence that God exists. But at one point in the Pensées, he takes a break and he says, even if you don't have a lot of evidence either way on the religious question, it still makes a lot of sense to be a religious person. And here's why. The exact same cost-benefit analysis that rational agents use when they're deciding how much to bet at a blackjack table at Vegas or how much money to put into a mutual fund, that same kind of reasoning should lead you into religious belief. And here's the basic argument. We're in one of 2 possible worlds. Either we're in the world where God exists or we're in the world where God doesn't exist. You don't have any control over that. But you do have control over your beliefs. You could be the kind of person who cultivates belief in God, or you could be the kind of person that cultivates atheistic belief. How do you cultivate belief in God? You might not be able to do it like that, like on a whim, but you could get up every Sunday and go to church. You could read religious literature. You could pray. And if you do that long enough, there are pretty good odds you're going to end up the kind of person believing that God exists. Likewise, if you sleep in every Sunday, you read a lot of Richard Dawkins, you refuse to look at beautiful sunsets, you're probably going to be the kind of person that cultivates atheistic belief over the course of your life. So that you do have control over. And Pascal says, look, the option where you cultivate theistic belief dominates rationally the option where you cultivate atheistic belief. What do we mean by that? Well, in the God world, if you cultivate a theistic belief, you win the lottery. This is like the best investment you've ever made in the course of your short life because you get eternal happiness in the afterlife. If you get it wrong, you bet that God exists, but there is no God, I mean, no big deal. What, you wasted your Sunday mornings. You got to read some beautiful literature. If you live as though God doesn't exist and you're wrong, you risk infinite penalty. Pascal is serious about the potential for hell. If you live as though there is no God and there is no God, you don't really get anything because you're in an experiential blank. There's no afterlife. So you don't even know that you were right. You don't even know that you won the bet at the end. So it seems like rationality dominates a certain kind of attitude. And this is a kind of doxastic voluntarism. Choose freely to believe in God because there are good things you're going to get if you do it. Now, most philosophers don't like Pascal's wager. There are a bunch of different problems with it. Paul, what's one problem with Pascal's wager?
Which God should you bet exists?
Oh my gosh, it's not like you're just cultivating theistic belief. You got to decide where you're going to go on Sundays, or where you're going to go on Saturdays, or should you be praying on Fridays? And these religions have really different bets about how to get that infinite reward. So there are a lot of different tables you could be placing your bets at, and it's not exactly clear from Pascal's wager which one it should be. That's one problem, but that's actually not James's problem with Pascal's wager. His problem with Pascal's wager is he thinks that anybody who takes this route into a leap of faith is a tool. And here's his basic argument. I mean, let's suppose that I decide, on the basis of Pascal's wager, I'm going to become Catholic. So I show up at Mass, I look up the Mass times, the Basilica's at 10 a.m. on Sunday. I slide into the pew with Paul, and I'm like, hey, Paul, I think I'm going to do this Catholic thing. I did the math. This is going to work out the best for me in the afterlife. Tell me where to sign up. And Paul's like, I'm really interested that you're, curious about the Catholic faith. Like, tell me a little bit more about your journey into this spiritual life. I'm like, there's no journey. I did the math. I just want to know, how often do I have to come? What do I have to eat in order to get access to this eternal reward? Like, Paul would be reasonable to say, and James says this, if that's my reasoning for trying to cultivate this leap of faith, whatever I'm doing, that's not religious faith. That's just something else. That's not a route into genuine Catholic faith. So James wants to develop a theory of leaps of faith that's not as cold and calculating and abstract as Pascal's wager, but still leaves room for the fact that people choose to take a leap of faith because they think it's going to lead to a better life for them. So that's the first dynamic that's going on here. There's another enemy in the background for William James. There's this guy, William Clifford. He's basically the Richard Dawkins of the mid-1800s. So he's a Cambridge professor, he's a scientist, he's writing these really popular atheist pamphlets where he's convincing people that only morons have religious belief. And the heart of Clifford's argument, one of the key pamphlets, uses this principle about belief as a key premise. Clifford says, if we reflect on what our obligations are with respect to our beliefs, we should all agree that it's wrong, always, everywhere, for anyone to believe something if they know they have insufficient evidence for that belief. So he uses that as his first premise. His second premise is that and it's controversial, is that there's not sufficient evidence for any of the claims of Christianity or Islam or Judaism. This is the premise that Anselm and Aquinas are going to freak out about. But the first premise is a premise about how you should manage your beliefs. Clifford says this is true, and if this is true, you should never take a leap of faith. It's always wrong to take a leap of faith. The example that Clifford gives is, let's suppose Paul is a shipowner. I'm just going to keep picking on Paul tonight. These examples are going to get more extreme, too. Let's suppose Paul is a ship owner, and he builds these ships, and he never really tests whether or not they're seaworthy because he has faith in his ships. He doesn't need to test them because he's a man of faith. So he builds these ships, and he sells tickets to a bunch of people to sail on one of his ships from England to America, and he's standing on the dock as the ship is leaving, and he's just like, I believe in you. I have faith that you'll make it. Clifford says, if Paul does that, not only is Paul committing fraud and putting those lives in danger, but Paul's also, it's ridiculous for him to have this kind of confidence in his ships if he's never even bothered to check out whether or not they work. He's doing something wrong intellectually, not only wrong in the promises he's making to other people. This might seem like a late 1800s example, but this is actually a major issue with business ethics today. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul for our contemporary Clifford argument.
Yeah, so one of the things we like to do with our students in our class is show them how these debates are alive and well today. So I'll introduce you to another figure. This is Elizabeth Holmes. I'm sure many of you have heard of her. But for those of you who haven't, here's a brief history. From the time that she was extremely young, she had one burning desire, and that was to be a tech billionaire, an entrepreneur. She wanted to be the next Steve Jobs, even down to the wardrobe. You can see she's wearing a black turtleneck sweater here. Steve Jobs was her hero. So she did what all aspiring tech billionaire entrepreneurs do. She dropped out of Stanford after her first semester as a freshman, and she founded a company called Theranos. Theranos is actually a mashup between the words therapy and diagnosis. Her original patent was for a device that you would put on your arm, and it would do a blood test, detect what disease you have, and then release whatever drugs you needed to cure that disease. It's total nonsense. It definitely didn't work. But she raised $6 million, and we all know that it's important to fail and to fail boldly, so she continued to build her company, and she actually came up with a prototype for a pretty interesting device. This is called the Edison. What the Edison does is it takes a microvial of blood, something that you can get just from pricking your finger rather than going and taking a venous draw from one of your veins, and you put it into the device, and it supposedly can do over 380 blood tests on the spot. It's small enough that it can fit into your home. It's about the size of a personal computer. And Elizabeth Holmes' vision is that this is going to revolutionize healthcare. It's going to put patients in charge of their healthcare and their health plan. The only problem is that the Edison never worked. It never worked from the very outset. There was no part of the Edison that worked. They said that it could do 4 classes of blood tests. It only ever actually aspired to do 1, but it never replicated any sort of accurate results, even on that 1 blood test. Okay. Now you might think that this is kind of crazy. Like, how could she continue to build a company knowing that her main product never worked? But at the same time, Steve Jobs, who's one of the heroes of Silicon Valley, was famous for believing in the products that he was creating, even when there was very little evidence that those products were going to succeed. So famously, in 2003, Steve Jobs went to one of his engineers and he said, in just a couple of years, we're going to have personal computers inside our pockets that have touchscreens. And his engineer said, you're insane. That's crazy. There's no evidence for that. But like a couple of years down the road, we all have iPhones in our pockets, right? So one question that we want to ask is, what is the difference? What's the difference between a case like Amanda Eller's case, or a case like Steve Jobs' case, and that of Elizabeth Holmes? I was actually lucky enough to meet the reporter John Carreyrou, who broke the story on Theranos, through a connection with the Alumni Association. Well, thank you guys, by the way. He was on campus, he was giving a talk, and so I sat down with him, and I just had this burning question. I said, was there a moment at which Elizabeth Holmes had the option of turning back and saying, you know what, okay, we're going to pull the plug, this isn't working, and chose not to? Or was it more just kind of a gradual descent into deceit? And he said, yeah, there was a moment. He's like, I'll tell you about it. So around 2014, Theranos partnered up with Walgreens and Safeway. They decided that they were going to ship these Edisons into Walgreens stores nationwide and start testing them on live patients. They set a particular date. And Elizabeth Holmes had a countdown calendar outside of her office. It's like 90 days until we launched this thing. And every day, the head of the lab at Theranos would come in and say, there's 90 days, we don't have a working device. People are going to go to the Walgreens, they're going to take their blood, they're going to put it in this thing, they're going to get inaccurate results. They could die because of this. And every day, Elizabeth Holmes said the same thing. She was just a pure picture of confidence. She would say, it's going to work. We're going to find a way to make it work. And then the engineers would come in, they're like, it's not going to work. And she would say, okay, you're fired, get out of here. There was just an insane amount of turnaround. 9 days before the launch, the head of the lab at Theranos comes in and says, there is absolutely no way this is going to work. And he said, so he was one of John Carreyrou's key sources, he said that for the first time, he saw fear in Elizabeth Holmes' eyes. She was shaking, and she said, you're right, I don't know if this is going to work. I don't know if we can do this. Maybe we should pull the plug. And he said, oh my gosh, thank goodness. She's rationally talking reason. Please, just like, they talked it through. And then at one point, she said, well, maybe instead of shipping the devices, we can just do the venous draws and have them tested back at Theranos Labs. And the lab director said for a second, he was like, yeah, that makes sense. He's like, no, that doesn't make any sense. And he turned around to tell her this, and he said, pure confidence. From that moment on, she went forward with the plan. We all know how it ends. Theranos was valued at $9 billion. Overnight, it just evaporated as soon as John Carreyrou's story came out. So our question, the question that we want to talk about for the rest of tonight, and that we want to talk to you all about, is what distinguishes these leaps of faith, these bad leaps of faith, from leaps of faith that we think might be necessary to living a good life?
So this gets us back to William James. His question is, when should you ask for more evidence and when shouldn't you wait for more evidence and you should take the leap? And we've been laying the groundwork with some philosophers he disagrees with. There's one more philosopher you got to know about to really understand James's view, and then the big reveal is coming. We're going to answer all of your questions. No, we're not. We're going to raise a lot of questions. There's one more philosopher that's in the background for James, and that's René Descartes. How many people here have ever read the Meditations or know anything about Descartes? Oh, that's great. All right, Sam, I might actually call on you for this one. So René Descartes, huge Enlightenment philosopher in the 1600s, beginning of the scientific revolution, very important mathematician. Descartes is deeply concerned with the role of evidence in our beliefs. And in particular, Descartes thinks in the age of Enlightenment, nobody should be satisfied with having beliefs that they know are unjustified. So this is kind of in the spirit of Clifford. You should know the grounds for your belief, and if you don't know why you believe something, You should get rid of that belief. You don't want beliefs swimming around in your head that are just biases or dogmas. You want beliefs that are based on reason. So Descartes in the Meditations, he just tells you how he's going to do this. He's like, I have a long day ahead of me without any interruptions. I've got a roaring fire going. I'm going to lock the door to my study, and I'm going to sit down in a chair and go through all of my beliefs one by one and toss out any beliefs that I don't feel like have good justification, that I can't be sure are unbiased. So he starts this process. Sam, by meditation 2, Descartes only has really one belief left. What is it? Yeah, Descartes starts this process, and he rules out whether he can know that 2 + 2 = 4, because he can't rule out whether God would deceive him about arithmetic. He can't be sure whether he's awake or asleep, so he can't be sure that he has hands or that he's dressed or that he's even in his home. Those beliefs all go out the window. At the end, the only thing he feels like can pass his test is the belief that he is, at this moment, a thinking thing. And then crickets. So you might think, Descartes, sure, that one belief is really strong. He's got a great argument for that one. But to live a life with such a narrow set of beliefs, with such a narrow intellectual vision, that's not necessarily a good life. And this is exactly what James says. James says, sure, some people are like Descartes. They really want to be certain that every single one of their beliefs is based in foundational evidence. But you might end up, as a result of following Descartes' procedure, of just having a really, really limited and narrow intellectual life. Some people are really risk-averse when it comes to how they live their lives of action. So some people think like, riding the go-karts, that's really dangerous. I'm just going to sit on the sidelines and cheer for you guys. All my friends are going skydiving this weekend, but I'm going to stay home and watch Netflix. That's the safe option. I'm going to invest all of my money in like gold bricks that I'm going to hide under my bed rather than playing the stock market. That is one way to live your life. That's totally fine if that's your way of living it. But James says, with both our intellectual lives and our lives of action, there are also some of us who are actually okay with risk. And James considers himself to be in this category. He's like, I would rather end up with a big, complicated intellectual system that has religion and politics and philosophy and literature and mathematics in there, and the possibility that some of those beliefs are contradictory or wrong, than to end up with the really narrow intellectual life that you get of somebody who's really risk-averse and who's unable to take leaps of faith. So James says that people like Descartes owe us some argument about why we should be so risk-averse when it comes to our intellectual lives compared with being accepting of risk. Now, it doesn't just mean believe anything. It's still bad for somebody like James if you turn out to believe things that are false. Just like it's bad if you're a risk taker and you fall off the cliff. I mean, that's still that's a bad outcome. Believing false things is still a bad outcome. But James says having a lot of beliefs and having a complicated intellectual life might be worth the risk for you. So that gets us into his theory. James wants to convince all these students at Brown, and Paul and I want to at least raise the question for you guys. When should you take a leap of faith when it comes to your beliefs? Here's the vision that James gives us. James says there are certain points in all of our lives where we face decisions about what belief systems to adopt. And sometimes we're facing options where all of the options feel live to us. What do we mean for a belief to feel live to us? This is how James tries to separate himself from Pascal. James says if a belief system feels live to you, it seems like a way of looking at the world that you could authentically adopt. So I can imagine in the year 2019, it's a live option for me to live out the rest of my life as a Catholic philosopher. It's also a live option for me to live out the rest of my life as an atheist philosopher. I can kind of get what it would be like to change course on this question. It's really not a live option for me to live out the rest of my life as a Muslim philosopher. I just don't know anything about Islam. I don't have any personal connection with Islam. It's not the kind of faith that I could just immediately uproot my life and jump into. It's not a live option for me. I might have a colleague in Afghanistan who's in a similar boat. He's thinking, I could imagine live option for me being a Muslim philosopher, live option for me is being an atheist philosopher, but couldn't imagine being a Catholic philosopher. That's not a live option for my belief system. James is going to say that this question of a leap of faith is going to partly depend on your starting point, and that's something we're happy to talk a little bit more about in Q&A. So that's the first thing. James says sometimes we face a choice and we've got 2 or more live options in front of us. The next 2 are when the leap comes in. So that the live part is when you see another cliff face that you could be on. The forced and momentous part is what pushes you over the edge. So James says, Sometimes we face these live options and we can't wait for more evidence without losing out on something that's really important. So sometimes our decision is forced. We just can't wait for more evidence about which belief system is true, and the decision is momentous. The choice that we make is going to determine how our life is going forward. And James thinks questions of religious leaps of faith fall into this category. But he's not going to argue with Clifford using the religious example. The way he's going to try to argue against Clifford is that he's going to argue there are so many ordinary leaps of faith that we take in our lives that follow this schema. They're live, forced, and momentous. And it's totally a good thing that we believed even before all the evidence came in. So what are the examples he gives us? This is the one that hits home most with our 18 and 19-year-old lovelorn Notre Dame students. He gives this really cute example of dating. So he says, let's suppose that you're on like your third date with someone, and you're starting to really get to know them, and there might be a little bit of spark there. And you've got to decide whether or not you are going to take the leap and believe that this person loves you. So you're thinking about whether to do it. You don't have enough evidence yet. It's only the third date. You have a little bit of evidence, but not a ton. James says, look, this option's live. You could imagine believing that this person loves you, or you could imagine holding back and not believing it. So both of them are live options for you. It's momentous. On one path, you can see this beautiful future where you get married, you have a bunch of kids, and you live happily ever after. On another path, you keep searching. You're back on OkCupid in a couple weeks. It's also forced. Why is it forced? Well, you might think you could demand evidence that this person loves you. So you could start collecting up the evidence. Maybe have like a notebook where you start looking at all the facts in this case. But what's going to happen if on the third date you start demanding evidence of this person about their feelings? You might say like, Paul, I need to look through your phone and make sure you're not texting anyone else. I need you to write a treatise about your actual emotions towards me, that's somehow convincing me that these are genuinely held emotions. In the process of asking for more evidence, you could destroy the possibility of a relationship. James is going to say a lot of relationships require this leap of faith because what makes the love possible in the first place is that you jumped beyond the evidence and were willing to take a risk on this other person and their thoughts and their feelings. So that's one kind of example. Another kind of example are maybe questions where we have to make a morally significant decision and the evidence is just not determinate yet, or we're not exactly sure what's happening. There was an example, James brings this up in his paper, but there was a really compelling example of this kind of argument in the New York Times 2 weeks ago. Naomi Oreskes, she's a Harvard professor, she wrote that we all have to take a leap of faith in this question of climate change right now. Even if you feel like you don't have enough evidence that's convincing you that we need to intervene on climate policy, if we wait for more evidence, we're going to miss out on something that's really morally important. So we should take the leap of faith. This is another example James would adduce. So here's the question that we want to raise for you guys, and now we're getting looks from the Alumni Association. We should let some of you all talk. James has to prove that our situation, when it comes to taking a leap of faith and loving someone, or when it comes to taking a leap of faith and forming religious commitments, is in the good case, the live, forced, momentous case. But Elizabeth Holmes, who chooses to believe that her blood testing device works when she has no evidence that it will, is the bad case. That's the irrational, wrong case for taking a leap of faith. Is he right? He might say, look, we are forced to take the leap right now on questions of religious faith or questions of moral importance. But Elizabeth Holmes, every day she could go into work and try to get some more evidence about whether the blood testing device was working. She always had the option of waiting for more evidence. You might say, well, no, she really didn't. I mean, that countdown clock was going. She's going to lose this huge contract with Walgreens if her product fails. So maybe she really was being forced off the cliff. Is that right? Another interesting question this raises for us, which Paul and I would love to talk with you guys more about, either here or at the reception, is what's the difference between the kind of evidence that we get for our religious hopes and our religious faith and the kind of evidence we get for whether or not a blood testing device works? You might think that one of the reasons why the question of faith is forced on us is not that we can't ask for more evidence. You know, you can pray, you can read more books about this particular religious tradition, you could try to find more reasons out there in the universe. But maybe we're just forced to think that the evidence that we're going to get is pretty limited, or it's never going to be fully convincing unless we're also willing to take the leap. These are all interesting questions for James and interesting questions for us, and puts him in dialogue with many of the other philosophers that we hope you guys will consider. But we want to leave this question for you guys, and we've got plenty more to talk about, but philosophy is a matter of debate and provocation, so we're hoping that you guys get to be part of the conversation now too. Thanks.
Great. So Sharon Kane is going to come up. She's going to read some of the questions that are coming in online, I believe. But if you have questions, you should have received in your packet a little card that you should feel free to fill out. And I believe Leah is going to collect questions. So as you fill out your questions, feel free to send those down the line. Leah will grab those, and then they will get read so that everybody online can hear us.
Thanks so much. Yes, they've sparked so many questions over the last several weeks in the Think ND Big Questions family. So we've been collecting questions for weeks and up and through this program. So let's get started with the first question, shall we? For those who come from a poor socioeconomic background and are thinking about a good life, how do you suggest they balance a financially stable life with pursuing their passions, when the two might not always overlap? Someone who might be in social work, passionate about social work, but choosing a more lucrative career.
You want to start, or should I?
You can start. This is a hard one.
These are hard questions, which is good. That's good. That's also a sign of the Notre Dame community. Here's how we're going to have to always preface this with, here's how I think about it. I suspect I'm going to say something and Paul's going to really disagree. That's the nature of our friendship. So the way I'm very interested in virtue ethics. So virtue ethics is the branch of philosophy that says that human beings all have a function. That function is to be happy, flourishing people. And over the course of our life, our biggest obligation is to figure out how to live up to that function. And for the Greeks, their idea of the function of a human life was really informed by their heroes. So are you powerful? Are you a brave soldier? Are you a great athlete? To live up to the standards of being a great human being, to really flourish, you've got to be able to cultivate all of those virtues. And for whoever asked this question, obviously, if you're somebody that starts off really low on the totem pole in Greek society, or if you start off in America in a really low socioeconomic background without a lot of opportunities, it's going to be hard for you to make the Olympics, hard for you to be a presidential candidate. So by Greek standards of flourishing, you might really struggle to live the good life. That is a problem with Greek philosophy. That's not a problem for people who are born into low socioeconomic strata. And one of the really cool developments of virtue ethics over the course of history is that once Christianity happens, and we get the teachings of Jesus, and we get the subsequent Christian philosophers as part of the conversation with virtue ethics, we get the same operating system, the same philosophy in the background. The goal of human beings is to live up to the function that we were born with and to develop certain kinds of virtues. But the virtues suddenly get reversed. So they become virtues that actually the poorest and lowest in society are capable of really flourishing with. So virtues like humility, virtues like obedience, virtues like love and faith and charity. And those become part of our vision for what it is to become a flourishing human. So I think one of the things, to put this person's question in perspective, obviously if you're born without a lot of resources, on the one hand, you're certainly going to be hindered in pursuing certain kinds of virtues. But virtue ethics any theory of virtue ethics that holds up these really lucky but kind of materialist outcomes as being why human beings are here is probably a problem with your theory about what humans should be aiming at, and a good reason to think about more sophisticated versions of it. I don't know, Paul, you want to add anything?
That seems right to me. I also, yeah, there we go.
It better.
Next question.
I'm Paul's boss.
I think that's right. I like that, and I would just add, there are many different ways to frame even like a virtue ethical approach in philosophy, and one of the ones that I'm really sympathetic to is a Thomistic, what I call like the Thomistic upgrade. So St. Thomas Aquinas was an Aristotelian. He thought Aristotle was right on a lot of these things. And yet there was something that troubled him about the way in which Aristotle described eudaimonia or flourishing or complete happiness. He thought this is really only something that like aristocratic people can have because you have to have a lot of friends, you have to have plenty of wine, a lot of time to just like sit around and contemplate the truth. And so if you look in the tradition, in the history of philosophy, figures like Augustine or Aquinas, I find the way that they reframe this question of what makes a life good in terms of their theistic belief and the ultimate end of human life being beatitude with God forever in heaven. It does the same sort of thing that you were describing other kind of Christian ethics as being capable of doing, which is sort of reframes what the virtues are, and it shows us that maybe some of the virtues, or maybe some of the things that aren't in our grasp because of unlucky features or certain kind of systematic features, maybe those aren't so essential to the good life. So I'm really sympathetic to that sort of picture, which I think is just a particular version of what you're talking about.
All right.
Great.
Next question. I've known many people who pursue the good life as they understand it, and when they reach midlife, feel their lives, with the exception of rearing children, meaningless. What is a healthy way of reorganizing one's values in order to experience a deeper, happier life?
So this is a great question. I think Paul and I have been debating this quite a bit. We're writing a book with Penguin about God and the good life. And our opening chapter deals with this question of burnout, which is definitely a live topic on a lot of elite college campuses like Notre Dame's, but it's also a huge topic among professionals, people who hit their 40s and 50s and think, man, everything's going right for me. Like, I've got a lot of money in my retirement account, I've got 2 great kids, I've got a sports car, but I'm not happy. It's this really interesting question about feeling like you've ticked all of your boxes, but there's still something missing. If you, like some of the stories I flashed up at the very beginning, you're tempted to think that burnout is like a 2019 phenomenon or something that only got invented when the internet got really important in our lives, or it's something that if you download the right sleep app, you're suddenly going to solve. And one thing that we talk about quite a bit, and I'm quite convinced of, is this has always been a problem for human beings. Especially successful human beings. It's one thing if you're always struggling to get your basic needs met. You probably don't have a lot of time to ruminate about whether or not you're flourishing or happy. But if you're the kind of person who's actually living, materially speaking, a really good life in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, you do have enough time to start to wonder, is this it? And we know that just pursuing happiness or just trying to tick off things on your resume, eventually you're going to start to feel empty if you go far enough down that path. One thing that philosophy is great for, and here we don't just mean like reading philosophy, but we mean asking yourself philosophical questions, talking with your friends and loved ones about philosophy, is it can help you get perspective on all of these different smaller goals and try to put them into a bigger picture of what you're actually aiming at in your life. So a philosopher's diagnosis of burnout is not necessarily that you should get more sleep, or that you should try to cut gluten out of your diet. Those might help you a little bit. But the philosophical analysis, and this goes back to Plato and Aristotle, is we experience burnout when we start to lose sight of a goal that's really stable and permanent that our life is aiming at. So you might think, like, my goal is to just get tenure at Notre Dame. I don't know where that goal would come from, but I might think, like, oh, I will finally be happy if I just get this contract in my job. And then you get tenure, and you're happy for like one day. And then you're just like, what do I do now? Should I just die? Having these achievements as your starting points, those are never going to be like permanent anchors for why you're here, for what your function on earth is. So the philosophers, and this is the philosophers even before Christianity are saying this, you've got to find something that's your kind of North Star, like the permanent anchor, the kind of thing that you're always going to be approaching over the course of your life. You're always going to realize is the explanation for why you're doing what you're doing. But it's never going to get to the point where you've crossed that threshold and then it's behind you. And so it's hard to figure out what exactly that goal is. I mean, this is Aristotle's entire career is trying to answer this question of what exactly that thing is that we're all aiming at. He says one of the best ways, and this is philosophers give practical advice. People don't know this about us. One practical piece of advice that Aristotle gives on this question is if you find yourself in midlife really feeling like you've lost your big core, your anchor goal, look around for people whose lives are somewhat analogous to yours, who are happy, who seem to be flourishing, who seem to still have a hard grip on what they're doing. And talk with them. Try to figure out how they're seeing the world, which habits and practices they're developing that are helping them keep that grip. And looking at real-life examples of people who seem to be flourishing can help you develop a theory for how to change your heading a little bit and how to put your goals in the right order. And that, I think, can be, I don't know, I haven't had a midlife crisis yet. I've come close. But I think, hypothetically, that kind of advice might help on a philosophical level. Paul, have you had a midlife crisis? Paul's younger than me.
Like 3. I've had like 3. No. But I will just say really briefly in response to this, this is a topic that we raise for our students quite a bit. And I just asked them last week in class about this very thing. We didn't put it in terms of midlife crisis, but if you look at burnout, the way that burnout is described, it really resembles kind of midlife crisis. They seem related. They seem deeply related. And so I just put the question to them. I asked them, what do you think it is that causes this burnout? What do you think it is that helps people get past the burnout? And amazingly, I had like a line of students come to my office hours and just offer me like a bunch of advice that I was just like, that's good advice. That's awesome advice. And what I learned from that is that, I think the achievement mentality, which again is just going to be really common at elite schools like Notre Dame, it does lead to this, right? Because you internalize this sort of external system of value that you then just assume somehow accurately reflects value out there in the world in some ultimate sense. And then, when you come to find out that that's just not the case, that like there's more value than just that, it's disorienting and it's confusing. The other thing that they kept telling me, and I found this to be really inspiring and hopeful, is that they felt like being at Notre Dame gave them, I want to say an advantage in this respect, but they felt like there were a lot of resources here for developing them holistically as persons and cultivating them and their interests and who they were. And they mentioned that these were the things that helped them move past those periods in their life. So we even had a student who referred to having a sophomore slump where he said like, I burned out, like had a mid-career crisis like at Notre Dame. And his response to that was to really lean into these resources that Notre Dame has that address them on a personal level, right? And they just say like, you're a person, you have value as a person, and here's how you can grow and develop. So I think that can be found in philosophy. It can be found in many different areas. But that's the insight that I've sort of gained from my students just by posing that question in the last week or so.
And Paul and I, and this is good advice for people who might be going through this in your family or in your friend group. I mean, Paul and I and everybody in our teaching team really make a conscious effort to tell our students constantly that we believe that their lives have intrinsic value, that they are so much more than whatever career they're going to have right after Notre Dame. Like being really aggressive about your view that people have functions and value in and of themselves, which maybe you think that doesn't need to be said, but honestly, in 2019 and in 400 BC, that could not be said enough to people because it can be hard to believe, especially when you're in the rat race.
Do you believe you can be good without God?
I'm passing that to Paul. You brought up the beatific
Why
vision.
did I? Okay. Do I believe I could be good? So this is where philosophers will like punt. They'll be like, is the question, can I be good without God? Or can one be good? So if we distinguish between those two, surely one can be good without God. So I guess the answer that I think of here is that, there are many different ethical frameworks, many different ethical views. Some of them depend on theism being true. The ones that I find to be live and authentic options for me have always depended on theism being true, that there's a God and that God loves us and that God is goodness and that God is identical with, beauty, truth, love, etc. Okay. And so I'm drawn to that sort of picture. I can't imagine my life without that sort of a picture. Okay, on the other hand, I know tons of atheists, and they're awesome. Like, I love my atheist friends. And when I ask them, and I do ask them, and I press them, and I say, okay, but where does ethical value come from? Or where does, moral value come from? What is your moral framework in guiding your answers? I can see how the framework works for them. I can see how they inhabit that and how they use it to interpret the world. But I'll say, I can't get myself all the way inside of it. And I think that's true on both sides. I don't think, or maybe that's not true. Maybe they can get all the way inside the religious worldview. But I think it's a challenge. So that's what I would say. I think there's obviously a sense in which there are multiple ethical frameworks, and people can inhabit these. I also argue a lot with my atheist friends because I think ultimately they're wrong, and I think they think ultimately I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, I want to know that I'm wrong, because the only thing I care more than being right is that I have the truth. So I think this is a good way of engaging with people that might have different ethical frameworks than you. So I think clearly there are good atheists in this room. That's how I would answer.
There's a big distinction in virtue ethics, which is the branch of philosophy that we're particularly interested in this class. There's a huge world of difference between being a moral person, which for virtue ethics means having the right kinds of habits that cause you to be courageous and loving and generous, and knowing the truths about the nature of morality, which is more of something that you study in college. There are lots of people who have not had the opportunity at all to think seriously about their theology or to think seriously about the very nature of moral claims, but who are still great people because they're still generous and loving and hopeful in their habits. And so if you think being good is just a matter of having the right kinds of habits that cause you to lead a flourishing life, it's part of virtue ethics that you can absolutely have those habits even if at the end of the day you don't necessarily have all the pieces in the big belief system lined up. And frankly, as a theist, as a Catholic, I'm very grateful for that because there are lots of questions about God and his nature and theology that I don't understand. I'm humble enough to know that I don't really understand the right perfect answer to the problem of evil. And so I'm glad that I'm still able to be a moral person in light of all the things that I don't know about God and all of the questions that I still have about faith.
Great questions, thoughtful answers. Thanks so much. I'd like to invite Dolly Duffy up to with some closing remarks.
Good work.
I hate the fact that we're done. I don't know about you. I could have gone on for a couple more hours. So I think I'll sign up for God and the Good Life in the spring. On behalf of all of us here at the Alumni Association, we just want to say thank you to Meghan and Paul. Thank you for tonight. Thank you for your commitment to educating the broader mass of alumni and friends from Notre Dame through this program. And thanks for your passion about the work that you do. Please give them a round of applause.